Welcome to another Big Train Tour at the Colorado Railroad Museum. This month, we'll be taking a look at Denver Rio Grande Western number 683. This 1890 vintage steam locomotive is today the only standard gauge steam locomotive that remains from the once mighty Denver and Rio Grande Western system. Even more significantly, this locomotive entered service just as the Rio Grande was completing its very first standard gauge east-west main route between Denver and Salt Lake City. Hi, I'm Paul Hammond, Executive Director of the Colorado Railroad Museum. Many rail enthusiasts today lament the fact that just one standard gauge Rio Grande steam locomotive survives, and indeed that's unfortunate. However, given that only one was saved, in many ways number 683 just might be the best and most significant example given its history. Come join me now as we take a look back at the standard gauging of the Denver and Rio Grande and how the railroad's fortunes were forever changed in the process. The Denver and Rio Grande is best known for having pioneered 3-foot narrow gauge for its railroad network in the Rocky Mountain region. The brainchild of General William J. Palmer, a decorated U.S. Army officer during the Civil War, the railroad beginning in 1871 built south from Denver towards Colorado Springs and Pueblo. The Rio Grande inaugurated service using small steam locomotives equipped with diminutive 4-wheeled tenders. Within just a half-dozen years, the Rio Grande's motive power fleet would begin to change drastically. Locomotives would grow in size, and the railroad would become Colorado's first to order consolidations for service. Over 150 narrow gauge examples of this wheel arrangement would be purchased in the years that followed. The consolidation wheel arrangement, as it was named, represented a notable advance in steam power. This type of locomotive featured 2 leading wheels to help guide it around curves and over uneven trackage, followed by 8 driving wheels which carried most of the locomotive's weight to aid in pulling power. There were no trailing wheels under the firebox, hence the Zero. The very first consolidation ever rolled out of Baldwin's Philadelphia Locomotive Works in 1866, responding to the growing demand placed on railroads following the Civil War. After 1875, the consolidation would become the most popular type of freight locomotive in the United States. It would be built in greater quantities than any other standard gauge steam locomotive wheel arrangement. And this is where our story diverts from narrow to standard gauge. Although the Denver and Rio Grande would build more narrow gauge mileage than ever before in the years 1881 and 1882, the company's management also saw that standard gauge competition was increasing. Unfortunately, the railroad's frantic expansion in the early 1880s led to a financial meltdown and forced it into receivership. The Rio Grande would slowly expand its dual gauge and standard gauge networks over the next few years as it prepared for bigger changes to come. By 1883, the Denver and Rio Grande system stretched from Denver to Pueblo, then headed west via 2 main routes. The first of these, which began as the railroad's main route to Salt Lake City, traveled west through the Royal Gorge, up over Marshall Pass, and then through the famed Black Canyon of the Gunnison River and north to Grand Junction. From Grand Junction, this route continued on via a subsidiary company to Green River, Utah, then up and over Soldier Summit and northwest to Salt Lake City. This same main route included a branch connecting Salida with the busy mining regions around Leadville. Another important route was the Rio Grande's San Juan extension, which connected Pueblo and Alamosa with the mining regions of southwestern Colorado, including Durango and Silverton. Nearly the entire Denver and Rio Grande system was narrow gauge at the time. While narrow gauge indeed helped to keep construction costs down for the railroad, it had one major liability: A narrow-gauge railroad line could only carry transcontinental cargo if it was unloaded and reloaded at the beginning and end of its journey. This expensive, labor-intensive process, known as transshipment, was a factor for every narrow-gauge railroad. But for the Rio Grande, it threatened the viability of the railroad's pioneering Front Range rail corridor, as well as its narrow-gauge main line west to Salt Lake City. The Denver and Rio Grande's management began addressing this issue within its first decade. The railroad dual-gauged its line between Denver and Pueblo in 1881, a move designed to stave off competition from several standard-gauge railroads that otherwise would have built their own tracks. This change also meant that standard-gauge locomotives were quickly needed. For the sake of expediency, the railroad asked Baldwin Locomotive Works to modify an order it had already placed for narrow-gauge steam locomotives. The Colorado Railroad Museum's fabled Denver and Rio Grande Western locomotive number 346, today the oldest operating steam locomotive in the Centennial State, was part of this very same 1881 order. Number 346, which was numbered 406 when first delivered, was one of 17 new 70-ton narrow-gauge consolidation-type locomotives. As it turned out, 5 of these new engines would have their track gauge widened prior to delivery, but otherwise they remained pretty much the same mechanically. These relatively small locomotives thus became the railroad's very first standard-gauge motive power. Traffic continued to grow along the railroad's Front Range main line, and within 2 years, the Rio Grande ordered more standard-gauge engines. By 1888, it had even become necessary to add double tracks along the most congested portions of the line from Denver to Pueblo. The proverbial handwriting was on the wall, even as this double tracking was being carried out. In the late 1880s, standard-gauge competitor Colorado Midland was in the process of completing a more direct but roughly parallel route from Colorado Springs to Leadville and on to Grand Junction. The Midland's goal was to route its trains through to Salt Lake City via the connecting Rio Grande Western, the narrow-gauge former affiliate of the Denver and Rio Grande, which had announced its plans to convert tracks to standard gauge. The Denver and Rio Grande knew that it would soon be in trouble if it did not complete its own standard gauge connection between Denver and Grand Junction. Otherwise, it would lose out on transcontinental rail traffic moving coast to coast between Denver, Pueblo, and Salt Lake City. In 1889, the Rio Grande started work to forge a standard gauge route between Pueblo and Salt Lake City via Leadville, Glenwood Springs, and Grand Junction. Its former Utah subsidiary, the Rio Grande Western, took on the job of rebuilding from the Colorado state line to Salt Lake City and Ogden, which it completed the very next year. This involved not only changing the actual gauge of the tracks, but also widening roadbeds, straightening curves, and grading and constructing about 100 miles of entirely new railroad. A completely realigned 50-mile segment following the Grand River through Ruby Canyon was the most significant part of this undertaking. We know this river today through this section as the Colorado, due to a 1920s-era name change. The Rio Grande had been slowly extending its narrow-gauge trackage from Leadville up over Tennessee Pass and heading west during the early to mid-1880s. By 1887, this line reached Glenwood Springs and continued north to the mining region of Aspen. Just 3 years later, in order to create its new standard gauge route, the railroad's tracks between Leadville, Glenwood Springs, and Aspen were re-gauged. A completely new standard gauge connection opened that same year between Glenwood Springs and Grand Junction. Standard gauge transcontinental rail traffic could now move from Denver and Pueblo to Salt Lake City over the Rio Grande system. Of course, new locomotives were now needed to facilitate this expansion. The Rio Grande had been adding to its standard gauge locomotive fleet throughout the 1880s, but the scale and speed of acquisitions suddenly ramped up. New motive power kept up with all the construction activity, And then even more new locomotives became necessary to pull trains just as soon as the line was complete. Between 1888 and 1892, the Denver and Rio Grande and its Utah connecting line, the Rio Grande Western, ordered well over 200 new standard gauge steam locomotives. 10-wheelers were preferred for passenger trains, and consolidations for freight trains and helper service. Of this total, nearly 150 were standard gauge consolidations, all of them built by the Baldwin Locomotive Works of Philadelphia. Our subject locomotive, number 583, was among a group of 27 consolidations delivered in 1890, the very same year the Rio Grande's new standard gauge through route was completed. At the time of its construction, locomotive number 583 was a modern, heavy-duty freight locomotive featuring an extended wagon-top boiler and a radial stay firebox. Built to burn coal and weighing in at 115,000 pounds, it was originally equipped with Westinghouse air brakes and Lincoln pin couplers. It would enter service as one of the railroad's most powerful locomotives, pulling heavy trains over the Rio Grande's new standard gauge Tennessee Pass main line. The early 1890s were a time of challenge for the Denver and Rio Grande. Not only had the railroad just constructed a new standard gauge main line, but simultaneously it was financing construction of the Rio Grande Southern Railroad, connecting silver mines in the rugged San Juan Mountains with existing Rio Grande lines at Durango on the south and Ridgeway on the north. Shareholders were not happy when expected dividends were withheld repeatedly. Company President David Moffett, known for his involvement in numerous other Colorado railroads, stepped down in 1891, and management moved to a status quo situation. Although some 30 new locomotives were delivered that year, no more would be in the cards for the next half-decade. Existing engines, including number 583, would be kept busy in the meantime. The Panic of 1893, touched off by congressional repeal of the Sherman-Silver Purchase Act, resulted in some 65 U.S. railroads entering bankruptcy that year. Luckily, the Rio Grande avoided this fate, but it did so by deferring expenditures whenever possible. Public condemnation was heaped on the railroad in the latter half of the 1890s, with poor service and frequent accidents leading to conjecture that the line was being bled to death for benefit of its owners. Things might have seemed bad for the Rio Grande, but they were worse for several of its biggest competitors. The mighty Union Pacific, which by the early 1890s had ownership interests in several Colorado railroads, entered a bankruptcy lasting several years beginning in 1893. And in 1897, the sprawling Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe system would also collapse, leading to the reorganization of the Colorado Midland, which for several years had operated as a Santa Fe subsidiary. Perhaps it's completely understandable then that the Rio Grande waited until 1898 to resume purchasing additional standard gauge steam locomotives, albeit in fairly small numbers as compared to the time frame around 1890 when the railroad first standard gauged its east-west main line. The 1899 standard gauging of its line over Levada Pass, connecting Walsenburg and Alamosa, was also a likely motivator. More 10-wheelers were first, followed by an order for 15 new consolidations in 1900. Of note, these new locomotives were more than twice the size of the railroad's very first 70-ton standard gauge locomotives delivered almost 2 decades earlier. The first years of the 20th century were troubled ones for the Denver and Rio Grande. Financier George Gould, son of the late railroad speculator Jay Gould, took control of the company along with the connecting Rio Grande Western and Missouri Pacific railroads. Together, these 3 lines became Gould's money machines to finance construction of the Western Pacific Railroad in its quest to build a new line connecting Salt Lake City with California's Bay Area via the Sierra Nevada's scenic Feather River Canyon. In In spite of these troubles, the Denver and Rio Grande had to keep up with the times. Its three-rail, dual-gauge trackage between Denver and Pueblo was converted solely to standard gauge in 1902. This in turn led to the purchase of an additional 30 new standard gauge consolidations that same year to handle the increased traffic. Also around this same time frame, the railroad's entire fleet, both standard and narrow gauge, would be equipped with automatic couplers, replacing earlier Lincoln pin models. Air brakes were also mandated for all locomotives and cars used in interchange service, with both of these requirements coming from the federal government. Locomotive number 583 followed suit, although the exact timing has been lost to history. More new consolidation-type locomotives would be acquired through 1908, as the railroad converted additional mileage to standard gauge and also constructed its 50-mile standard gauge oddity, the Farmington branch, heading south into New Mexico from the narrow gauge interchange town of Durango. Also in 1908, George Gould merged the Rio Grande Western and the Denver and Rio Grande railroads, meaning that going forward, the Denver and Rio Grande would be buying standard gauge locomotives and cars for both parts of its now combined system. The Rio Grande Western also happened to own a 50% interest in the Colorado Midland, which would factor into the Rio Grande's finances just a few years later. In 1910, the inevitable happened on the motive power front. The Denver and Rio Grande decided it was time to begin acquiring bigger and more modern locomotives. Its first were articulated locomotives of a 2662 wheel arrangement, specifically intended for helper service on the steep western approaches to Tennessee Pass and Soldier Summit. The new locomotives would spell the end of a spectacular but expensive practice of using 5 steam locomotives to pull heavy trains over these mountain passes. The very next year, the railroad converted its 3-rail trackage between Pueblo and Salida through the Royal Gorge to standard gauge only. As it turned out, even the new articulated locomotives were no match for the 4% grades of Soldier Summit's western approach, which served as a functional bottleneck on the Salt Lake City to Denver main line. The railroad in 1912 launched a line relocation project, taking advantage of more favorable grades, and completed the next year. But with more articulated locomotives on the way in 1913, this time of an even larger 2882 wheel arrangement, it was becoming clear that bigger locomotives were the wave of the future for freight service on the Denver and Rio Grande. In 1916, the railroad ordered 10 locomotives with a 210-2 wheel arrangement, at the time the world's largest 2-cylinder steam locomotives. These were intended to serve as helpers on Tennessee Pass and to pull heavy coal trains along the Front Range. But with their tremendous power, these locomotives ended up assigned to high-volume coal service in Utah. The railroad had also begun purchasing bigger and heavier locomotives for passenger service, starting with Pacific-type locomotives featuring a 462 wheel arrangement. The Denver and Rio Grande's precarious place in George Gould's financial house of cards unraveled in 1918, unfortunately. The situation was complicated by the entry of the United States into World War I in 1917 and the takeover of the U.S. railroad network by the U.S. Railroad Administration late that year. Unfortunately, the Colorado Midland, in which the Rio Grande owned a 50% interest, would effectively turn its last wheels during the war. Given its more direct, on-paper routing between Colorado Springs and Glenwood Springs, the Midland had been assigned the bulk of east-west traffic to start with. But with its tracks and equipment in even worse shape than those of the Rio Grande, the Colorado Midland became gridlocked. The railroad administration quickly reversed course, assigning all east-west traffic to the Denver and Rio Grande. This turned out well in an odd sort of way. Most railroads greatly disliked U.S. Railroad Administration control, but in the case of the Rio Grande, it came with a silver lining. The railroad was being operated under U.S. Railway Administration direction, protecting it somewhat from its own financial creditors. The railroad in 1918 sought court protection by going into financial receivership. Needing motive power urgently, but having no funds to purchase new locomotives, it would work hard during World War I and the years immediately following to keep existing locomotives operating as best it could. Although detailed records are lacking for locomotive number 583's assignments during this time, it most likely was still found in mainline service, pulling heavy freight trains. Plenty of older engines just like it remained in service on a railroad that was increasingly worn out and lacking maintenance. It was a repeat of the late 1890s all over again. After going back into a second financial receivership in 1922, the new Denver and Rio Grande Western Railroad finally emerged in 1924 with a new name, but still under the control of the Western Pacific and Missouri Pacific Railroads. Nonetheless, the situation was sufficient for the railroad to restart purchases of newer and more modern locomotives. Mountain-type locomotives with a 482 wheel arrangement were procured in 1922 and 1923, along with additional 2882 articulated freight locomotives. In 1924, every locomotive in the Rio Grande's fleet was renumbered and given a new mechanical designation. Locomotive number 583 one day found itself repainted with the railroad's new corporate identity, and its number changed to 683. Its former Class 120 mechanical designation was likewise changed to C-28, with the C short for consolidation and the 28 indicating the locomotive was rated at just under 28,000 pounds of tractive effort output. As the 1920s economy continued to improve, additional 482 mountain locomotives were purchased, along with another batch of 2882s. These newer and more powerful locomotives would start the locomotive dominoes game for the Denver and Rio Grande Western's standard gauge fleet, similar to the process already well underway with the railroad's older narrow gauge fleet. Smaller and older standard gauge consolidations, such as number 683, would find themselves bumped from mainline service into switching and branch line work. In 1930, the locomotive's pilot or cowcatcher was removed, replaced with footboards so switching crews could easily step on and off. A second sand dome was added to supply additional sand while switching, in order to help keep the wheels from slipping in this slow-speed service. To allow room for this second dome, the steam dynamo, which provides electricity for lighting, was moved to a new location in front of the smokestack. All over the Rio Grande system, consolidations and 10-wheelers were being placed in storage, with many being scrapped as the Depression wore on. Records show their numbers dwindling all through the 1930s. More new Rio Grande steam locomotives were delivered in 1937 and 1938, 484 Northerns and even bigger 4664 articulated Challenger types, contributing to the ongoing evolution. Now approaching 50 years of service, increasingly diminutive locomotive number 683 was assigned to Leadville for switching by the late 1930s. In the early 1940s, it was still in service, somehow outlasting many similar engines. Perhaps this was due to sheer luck, or perhaps because the locomotive's mechanical condition simply had remained constant and reliable. Even as the 1890 vintage locomotive continued in service, however, the Denver and Rio Grande Western purchased its first diesel-electric locomotives and would purchase its last steam locomotives, more of the articulated 4664 Challenger type wheel arrangement, during World War II. Number 683's appearance was even modernized somewhat, with its wooden cab replaced during this time by a larger steel cab, itself sourced from a scrapped locomotive, and a steel flue pilot was installed to replace the footboards. But nothing lasts forever, particularly 19th century locomotives still in service well into the 20th century. Number 683 was finally retired by the Denver and Rio Grande Western in 1947, quote, on account of age, small capacity, and obsolete type, unquote, according to official documents. Those terrible-sounding words explaining that locomotive number 683 had been retired were, fortunately, written to help facilitate the sale of the locomotive. This sale transferred number 683 to another Colorado railroad looking for an operating steam locomotive. The San Luis Southern Railroad, incorporated in 1909, was built to develop Colorado's southern San Luis Valley. Connecting with the Denver and Rio Grande Western at Blanca, some 20 miles east of Alamosa, the little line at one time extended south for 31 miles to the town of Joroso. In the late 1920s, the railroad's name was changed to the San Luis Valley Southern, the result of its first bankruptcy. Never very prosperous, the little railroad nonetheless offered both passenger and freight service with farm produce, fertilizer, and lava rock among the items regularly transported. Locomotive number 683 joined 3 other former Rio Grande consolidations previously purchased by the railroad, all of them from the same C-28 classification. On the San Luis Valley Southern, the former number 683 was numbered 106, and it dutifully began pulling trains along the line. The late 1940s was a turbulent time for this short line, and a series of proposed abandonments and financial arrangements were floated for the San Luis Valley Southern. In 1954, the line's fortunes stabilized somewhat, with new owners taking over. But their plans called for reducing operating costs, and using a former Denver and Rio Grande Western locomotive tender frame, they proceeded to build one of the oddest locomotives ever to grace a Colorado railroad. Steam train operations had ended on the southern San Luis Valley by 1957, within 10 years of the railroad first placing 280 number 106, the former Denver and Rio Grande Western number 683, in service. Somewhere along the line, number 106's original tender had also gotten replaced, but no matter. The 1890 consolidation would slumber peacefully in the line's Blanca engine house for several years, with an inglorious ending almost certain, barring some kind of a miracle. Once again, however, as had happened with other long-forgotten but iconic Colorado Railroad artifacts, railroad historian and Colorado Railroad Museum founder Bob Richardson came to the rescue. By the early 1960s, San Luis Valley Southern number 106 was the only steam locomotive remaining on the railroad's property. Richardson knew its heritage, and after purchasing the engine in 1962, he made arrangements to transport the locomotive to Golden. The main challenge was that number 106 hadn't operated in over 8 years, and it was unsuitable for interline movement on its own wheels. The museum in early 1963 worked with the Denver Rio Grande Western to have a flat car spotted in Blanca. Then a ramp of ties and rails was built leading out of the engine house where the locomotive was quietly resting. After winching and securing the locomotive aboard, it was moved some 200 miles to Denver by the Rio Grande, then forwarded on to Golden by the Colorado and Southern. A tractor-trailer rig was brought in for the final transfer to the locomotive's new home at the Colorado Railroad Museum. Displayed initially as San Luis Valley Southern number 106, the pioneering standard gauge locomotive was soon backdated and lettered to represent its early Denver and Rio Grande number 583 identity. It sported this appearance through the late 1990s. Then, as the museum's new Robert W. Richardson Library was being completed, the locomotive was nominated to the Colorado Register of Historic Places. Given another cosmetic overhaul in the early 2000s, with the correct tender being substituted thanks to the Durango and Silverton Narrow Gauge Railroad, locomotive number 683 was returned to its later appearance on the Denver and Rio Grande Western, which it continues to showcase today. Long displayed on disconnected tracks just west of the original museum depot building, Number 683 and its short passenger train consist were finally connected to the museum's operating railroad network circa 2012 and moved to new locations. The locomotive has since been on exhibit near the museum roundhouse, joined in recent years by another standard gauge icon of the Denver and Rio Grande Western, tunnel motor number 5401. Thanks for joining me today. Denver and Rio Grande Western steam locomotive number 683 is not only a Colorado icon, but also a powerful reminder of standard gauge railroads and their importance in connecting our world throughout North America. The fact that it remains the only Denver and Rio Grande Western standard gauge locomotive to have been preserved is also significant. The locomotive's existence today is cause for celebration, given that its service history encompasses the early days of standard gauge railroading in the Colorado Rockies and well into the diesel age. I hope you've enjoyed learning about Denver and Rio Grande Western number 683 today. And I also hope that your appreciation of Colorado's rich railroad heritage continues to grow with each and every tour of the museum's collections.
Like, comment, share, and subscribe. Commenting and sharing in particular may qualify as virtual engagements for important funding programs like the SCFD.